So it's just to add that in Ireland, social and economic history then has always had a small but significant presence. There's a journal which the social and economic historians publish, and it has quietly supported the scholarly local history from its beginnings. So these are some of the sort of the causes or the things that took place that really brought about local history. But what is local history now? Well, because you're probably thinking, isn't it about time that I got to the point of all of this, about what really is local history then? So let's have a look then at this new local history and what it looks like. And so what I'm basically going to say over the next sort of 5 minutes is that there are these 5 main characteristics, I think, if you are going to be thinking about doing some local history. I think the first thing to remember really is that local history is not necessarily so much about places, it's about people. Hold on, how can that be? Because isn't the very essence of local history that it is about a particular place? Well, as Raymond Gillespie, and I confess I borrow this entirely from him, and give him entirely the credit for this, is that the problem with this is that places really can be defined in very different ways. Take the parish, for example. In England, this is a relatively unproblematic unit of measurement. But in Ireland, which parish will you use? Will you use a civil parish that was constructed by the government? Will you use an Anglican parish? Or will you use a Catholic parish? Not only that, but parish boundaries weren't always fixed and could easily change, and quite often did. Townlands appear and disappear over the course of the 19th century. So instead, in order to get around this, Raymond Gillespie argues that local history should be the study of people in a particular place over time. Now, if we want to include all of the ordinary people who lived in a place, we could be talking about a considerable number. So Gillespie goes on to suggest that people within a particular area can be studied as part of what he calls a community of interest, such as a landed estate, a church congregation, a social group, or a political party. And for me, I think this makes a great deal of sense. Local history, which had always appeared to me as an outsider to be too parochial, too narrow, of no interest to me because I didn't understand or know the local area, suddenly has the potential to tell me what a specific group of people are doing in a particular area that could be potentially really interesting. Because I think people are extremely interesting. So the other thing then to remember about local history is that it charts change over time. And again, to continue to borrow from Raymond's ideas, if local history is about communities, then one thing we know is that communities do not stay the same. They change over time, particularly in Ireland, which has been so deeply influenced by migrations of all kinds. So part of the interest then in studying them is to identify what those changes were and to ask why they took place. So local history tries to adopt some kind of a time scale. The population historians and the historical geographers like to use a couple of 100 years, because that enables them to see how population rose and fell. Social and economic historians might want to use less time, perhaps because they're only interested in, say, the growth of the railways, or in the rise and fall of the local Women's Institute. And while it's possible to do local history, which is just a snapshot in time, and I'm thinking, for example, Leslie Clarkson's work on Armagh, where he looks at Armagh in a specific year, I still think that it has to refer to the time before or after for that picture to be really properly understood. So the third thing about local history then is that it needs to be comparative and contextualized. I think we would all agree that despite the words of Simon and Garfunkel, that no person is a rock or an island. And the same can be said for localities and communities. None of them have developed in isolation from the world of influences all around them. No matter how far away from the center of power, no matter how poor the transport links were, even the most remote community has felt the impact of national events. And as a result, the local history being written today tries to acknowledge this wider context. This means that local history at certain key points needs to actually be about bigger history. History of the locality, of the region, of the country, potentially even the world. Thus, local history today tends to adopt a more flexible approach to its boundaries. While the focus might be a particular townland, the researcher also looks to the surrounding area for influences and ideas, because it's only through comparison with others that we can truly say how original, how poor, how violent, how civic-minded our particular area is. Therefore, the pursuit of local history will end up not always being just about one locality, but potentially about many. The fourth point is about local history is that it adopts a creative use of sources and evidence. What was so interesting to me when I first read Eston Evans's work was his really quite strong criticism of his colleagues in the history department at Queen's for what he felt was their obsession with historical documents. He believed that written records would never provide an accurate picture of a locality. They needed to be combined with an understanding of its physical landscape, its collective memory, that accumulation of oral traditions and stories, folk beliefs and attitudes which make every place unique and distinct. And what this means in modern terms is that local historians need to use a range of sources if they are going to reconstruct the history of their area. They'll need to rely on written sources, of course, but they should also be doing geography and oral history and looking at natural history, looking at music potentially, all sorts of different areas. And this might sound incredibly difficult and time-consuming, but as Donald Akinson points out, life lived at the local level is marvelously complex, and every element within that community interacts with the other. So if the local historian is going to reflect that complexity, that diversity, then he needs to use, or she needs to use, an equally diverse range of methods and sources. In this respect, unlike my religious history that I do, local history is really total history. Finally, we always hope, I think, that local history will aspire to be critical and analytical. And by critical, I don't mean mean or nasty. I mean that it adopts an independent view onto the sources that it's considering, and that it's trying to say something interesting about its subject. Now, there's lots of different types of local history that are floating around. Because I think that with these characteristics, there's still lots of room for anyone thinking about embarking on a local history project to do something which reflects their local area and their own local interests. So you can see here that I've just thrown down a list of different kinds of local histories that have already been written and which you, depending on the types of sources that you come across, could potentially engage in. Okay, so a very popular one is looking at population, looking at the numbers of people who live in a particular area and looking at how that figure changes over time. Another one would be land ownership and farming. Who owned the land? What were the farms like? Another one would be the case study, the national history localized. What was the 1916 Rising like in your area, for example? And then there's the idea of microhistory, that all you're trying to do is accumulate all of these minute stories, say, about a particular subject or topic, and collect them all together. You might want to look at a particular family in a community, or a set of families. Or you might want to look at the social or economic aspects of a local area. Now, all of these are absolutely valid, and in your packs that you got tonight, there's a little worksheet that should take you through some of those subject areas, so if you wanted to explore them further. Now, there's a couple of reasons why you might want to, before you go home tonight, reconsider your local history project. Okay? Because if we remember Don Akinson, local history is devilish hard work. The sources for Irish history have often been hard to find, scattered, patchy, or even non-existent. Some of this can be attributed to Ireland's poverty. Some of it can be attributed to the destruction of the Public Record Office in Dublin in 1922. But the trouble with Irish local history can also be attributed to its complicated relationship with Britain over time, where religious and linguistic differences, local versus civil boundaries, the patchy and uneven adoption of civil government, the differential treatment of the Catholic population, has all had an impact on the documentary record. So, for example, church records quite often tend to be patchy or difficult to interpret between 1790 and 1820. Unsurprising when you think that that was the time of the United Irishman Rebellion. Not only that, but local history has always played Cinderella to the many professional historians who argue that national history is really the most important type of history to do. And as recently as May this year, Richard English says, nationalism is arguably the most important framework within which to explore, explain, and understand modern Irish history. This, however, flies in the face of local historians who argue that local history is important in providing a particular story, which challenges these sterile generalizations, which some of them refer to them as. It liberates, local history does, the marginalized, such as women, minorities, the poor, and those who are undocumented. Not only that, but it gives people a sense of place and roots them into their communities. And as Raymond Gillespie has said elsewhere, it's badly needed to correct and deepen our understanding of the evolution of Irish society. Local history is the groundwork fundamental to our understanding of the country as a whole. Now, since the 1980s and the 1990s, it can be argued that there have been a range of reasons and trends that have been at work making local history more popular and more accessible. There's the growing anonymity of urban culture, some people suggest. We all live in cities and we want to understand our place. There's a growing interest in history and genealogy, being able to do things for yourself, the spread of the internet, and the growing availability of online sources all make local history easier than it ever has done before. So I think that there has never been a better time to do local history. Archives and repositories like PRONI have been sinking considerable resources into large digitization projects, and many of these are becoming available for the very first time. This has improved access to documents like never before, enabling them to be studied and allowing for new interpretations to be made. Hopefully this lecture tonight and the ones to come in this series will help develop and bring about these new interpretations and new discoveries and enable them to see the light of day for the very first time. And hopefully you'll be able to be part of that process. Thank you very much.